Peter Cardwell. I guess, Peter, what is telling in that last sentence between the Prime Minister and Boris Johnson's team? Have Rishi and Boris actually got together around the table, broken bread, had a bit of a croissant, maybe some Vimto? Have they done this? Did they meet?
Very unlikely, given the history of all of this. It sort of reminds me a bit of the 1950s Hollywood classic Sunset Boulevard, when the writer goes up to Norma Desmond and says, "I know you, you're Norma Desmond, you used to be big." And then he goes, "I am big. It's the Conservative Party that got small." And you can sort of see Boris Johnson saying, "Thankfully, finally, you've asked me to come back and rescue the Conservative Party from the doldrums of the polling that it is in at the moment."
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting the way press releases and the like work. You know, Boris Johnson's team. I mean, what is Boris Johnson's team? He has no need for a team. He might have a PA, he might have a person that he can defer to. He clearly still gets security. But the idea that there is a team in place like he's another party is nonsense.
Well, there's a couple of people who work for him. One of them is actually Lord Kempsell, formerly of this parish, Ross Kempsell, who is his press spokesman. So we don't know, but we know that this is someone familiar, as we're told, with Boris Johnson's thinking, may well be him, who has briefed this out to the Times' doyen of political coverage, Steve Swinford. So I expect it is the truth. I expect it is happening. And the fact that Boris Johnson can be expected to be in some of those Midland constituencies, red wall constituencies, the kind of places by implication, if Boris Johnson is going there and has been brought back to try to win them, that Rishi Sunak just isn't having an impact in. And we know from the polls, not just generally nationally, but also more locally, and from by-election results as well, for example, in Rochdale, but elsewhere as well, that Rishi Sunak and his brand of conservatism just isn't making an impact, whereas Boris Johnson's, of course, did in 2019, although the political weather was very, very different then in terms of Brexit and the fact that the Conservatives didn't face Keir Starmer, who's a formidable opponent, despite what people may think of him, but Jeremy Corbyn, who quite frankly wasn't.
Yeah, well, it was seen as the perfect BBC cocktail, wasn't it? Boris, Brexit and Corbyn were the three factors. Now, of course, Boris will be there, we are told. I'm not sure how present he will be and how regular he will be. There's a lot of seats to try and get through in 6 weeks and create an impact along the way, but he'll get the headlines. But in addition to that, I mean, Brexit, the jury is kind of out because there's not a lot been happening globally. We've had the pandemic. And Corbyn's no longer there, as you rightly allude to. So, I mean, even with Boris in those seats, is it likely that Boris Johnson can save a single red wall seat? That's the question, isn't it?
Well, he has a level of magic and connection that very few MPs have, but I don't think it's an accident that this story has emerged within 24 hours of Lee Anderson going over to Reform UK. Now, Lee Anderson had been suspended from the Conservative Party parliamentary party, and of course that was going to gain so many different headlines. And of course, Lee Anderson is seen as someone who really can speak to, and indeed for in many cases, the red wall. Well, Boris Johnson did that too. Obviously, very different character from a very different background, but nonetheless connected in a way that perhaps Lee Anderson connects, and other people maybe like Nigel Farage, and certainly not in a way that Rishi Sunak does not. So I think it's very interesting. I think it's very timely. I'm not surprised that Boris Johnson wants some sort of role. He's been globe-trotting, helping his friend President Zelensky. But now back in the UK, and of course, we don't know when the election is going to be. If it's going to be in early May, around the same time as those local elections and elections for the Manchester mayor and London mayor and other mayoral races as well, well, then Rishi Sunak needs to make his mind up probably in the next 10 days or so, because you need 25 working days before an election. I don't think that's going to happen. As you correctly pointed out in the previous segment, there hasn't been a budget bounce at all in the polls for the Conservatives. So I think they'll float this test balloon, they'll see where things go, but we won't be seeing Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak on any stage anytime soon. I think it's going to get tricky for Rishi Sunak as well when journalists thrust questions in Boris Johnson's face saying, "Do you 100% back Rishi Sunak and think he should be the Prime Minister for the next 5 years?" How's he going to answer that one? I think there could be a bit of equivocation. But Boris Johnson, never, ever underestimate him, never, ever say his career's over, because as we've seen on many, many occasions, he bounces back.
Well, on that point, he also doesn't do anything for no reason. There's going to be motive behind this. What's the wider plan for Boris then? I mean, putting aside what he does or doesn't do or say or doesn't say in those red wall hustings, what's his game here? Because there is one being played, Peter.
There's always a game going on with Boris Johnson. There's always a strategy. Now, separate to Boris Johnson, or so he would have us believe, there are people who think he should come back in a blaze of glory and become leader of the Conservative Party again, perhaps even Prime Minister again. They're led by a woman called Lady McAlpine, Judy McAlpine, who has lots of money. She's a Tory donor, and there are various people in the Conservative Democratic organisation like David Frost, Lord Frost as well, who believe this should happen. There was some private polling that happened that showed that Boris Johnson was popular, that Rishi Sunak was very unpopular. And if you show an MP polling in regard to their constituency specifically, and that says you would win with Boris Johnson but lose with Rishi Sunak, as some of that polling appeared to show, well, they're going to change their minds, because first and foremost, politics is about winning and it's about survival. And if people see that Boris Johnson is something that can perhaps not turn around the fortunes of the Conservative Party, I think it would take a miracle to do that, given the polling consistently over the past 2 years. Nonetheless, Boris Johnson probably isn't going to do any harm to the Conservative Party and to their electoral prospects, despite the fact that there are many people still very angry about how he handled COVID, the lockdowns, and of course, Partygate.
Yeah, indeed. Peter, thank you as ever. Peter Cardwell, our chief political correspondent.